mentioned, I want to give a little bit more context of where we're coming at this from. So, this is not media studies or cultural criticism, though we both have a lot of opinions on those different cultural events. Both of our backgrounds are in intelligence and threat analysis. And so, what that means in practice is that we're using the same analytical frameworks that are used in more traditional terrains that we're a little bit more used to reading about. And we're adapting those to those cultural spaces that have been ignored for like, yeah, a myriad of reasons. And so we want to try and understand better the narratives, the actors, the TTPs that are used in cultural spaces and how that overlaps into some more overt political discourse. And so we want to analyze how that works across multiple platforms and then translate some of those findings for different users. And so we are both working on this alongside our full-time jobs. And the reason we want to mention that is because that's how strongly we feel about this. This has not necessarily been looked at. And so that's why we want to try and solve that gap and look more into cultural terrains and pop culture in general. Rachel, I'll let you go on with some of the history behind this.
Thank you. Can we have the next slide? So we get a lot of questions about why this matters. I don't want to go as far as to say pushback, but maybe sometimes it has actually pushback. But I think that there are some like historical ways to view this that shows that what we're claiming is just underanalyzed. We all know in this space that propaganda is a real thing, and almost all of us are familiar with the Cold War. Um, and so it's a really good way to understand that both the US and the Soviet Union recognized how much cultural events carried geopolitical weight. And think about the Olympics, especially the Olympics during the Cold War. I would bring up hockey, but it might send people into a frenzy over the recent hockey show. So we'll stick to some other things. But this is a known playbook. So it's a known playbook that culture matters. In the early days of the internet, we had a lot of identity-based manipulation tactics, which we obviously have more of now. Um, and those were particularly visible in the targeting of women. Non-consensual intimate imagery of female celebrities has gone back to the start of the internet. The weaponization of female public figures as a narrative tool didn't just start with social media. Zoe, I think you wanted to add some things here.
Yeah, so an example of this is with the case of Paris Hilton. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, she had a video with some intimate sexual explicit imagery of her that was released against her consent by an ex-partner. And so I think an interesting way of looking at this is that now, 20 years later, she is on the Hill campaigning with representatives such as AOC for the Defiance Act in the US, which would enable victims of non-consensual intimate imagery that are generated by AI to sue their creators. So I think this illustrates that these tactics they evolved with the different tech that is available, but it's still rooted in the same ideology, which in this case is misogyny. And a second element to this is that regardless if you're running for office or nominated for a Grammy or a reality TV star, etc., the same type of tactics are used against, in this instance, women, but also when we're talking about identity-based disinformation more broadly against marginalized groups. And so if we want to have a full understanding of what's going on, we need to be paying attention to political spaces, but also cultural spaces.
Exactly that. It's that celebrity controversy and identity outrage cycles are a testing ground for narratives that can later be used to shape elections, policy debates, public trust, all of the things that we really care about when we're talking about information integrity. Next slide, please. So cultural spaces go largely unmonitored from an information integrity perspective. Um, and because they go on unmonitored, that makes them particularly useful, right? Because anyone can access them, anyone can seed narratives to them, anyone can test TTPs, because everything inside of them looks like entertainment. That's with quotation marks, entertainment or gossip. And often the audiences that start in those spaces are not necessarily political. They're fans, they are people who are actively engaged with celebrity drama. They like to watch how these events unfold in snippets, like in TikTok or Instagram videos, and they're not necessarily there for geopolitics. But the four mechanisms on this slide are things that we have consistently observed. So, and again, this goes across most information integrity spaces, but it's important to think about them in this specific context. So memes strip complexity and travel faster than any context we could ever seed or reseed. Narrative seeding interjects frames into organic conversations before anyone has noticed. Platforms reward outrage and certainty, and identity-based disinformation does the heaviest lifting by making ideology feel like culture. We'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. But that last one is super important because when misogyny, racism, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric are wrapped into celebrity commentary, they are often stripped of their political position and argued from an opinion. And once that opinion is seated, false opinions, or not, it's really hard to claim that space back. So Zoe's going to talk to us about 4 or 5 different case studies. So I'm going to be quiet and let her do that. Next slide, please.
Okay, so the first case study that we have is Eurovision, which I'm sure most people of this call have heard about Eurovision, but in case you haven't, it's a song contest which has mostly European-based countries take part in it. It also has some countries from outside of Europe, for instance, Australia. It started in 1956. And it's a really good entry point because you have genuinely a massive audience and it's politically disengaged because you have your guard down when you're looking at Eurovision. You're interested in the outfits and the songs, and you're very much coming at this through an entertainment perspective, not necessarily a political or geopolitics one. And that's what makes it a really good terrain. And so the Kremlin has understood that for years. And so we've seen that Russian state media has for years used Eurovision to frame it as evidence, for instance, that the West and Western moral is declining. And an example of that is the gay Europa narrative that is used again and again by Russian state media as evidence that European culture is being destroyed by giving a platform, in this instance, to LGBTQ artists. So an example of that is Conchita Wurst, who was an Austrian drag queen who won the 2012 edition of Eurovision. And that example has been used again and again to reiterate that message of Western decline. And so here you have very much building off pre-existing narratives. And then you're doing Eurovision to kind of like disseminate that further and to a broader audience. What happened in 2022 after the war in Ukraine is that Russia was excluded from Eurovision. It used to be one of the candidates in Eurovision. And so we didn't see a disengagement of Russia, but just a shift in how Eurovision was used. So, for instance, immediately after the exclusion, the Kremlin used Eurovision to kind of like further disseminate this Russophobia narrative that was also being spread in other contexts. And so, using the example of Eurovision to say, well, Russia is actually a victim of Europe in this instance, and it is being vilified, and that's why it got excluded by Eurovision. And then the second step to that was building a counter narrative, and so another platform with the Intervision Song Contest, which was modeled off of Eurovision, but the countries that were in Intervision are Russia, and then from a little bit all over the world. And so here, what we see is that there's an alternative space that was created, and that was very much framed as representing traditional cultural values, which again goes back to some of the narratives that are spread by the Kremlin. And so some of the tactics that you can see on your screen, narrative injection, symbolic reinterpretation, cross-platform building, etc. These are tactics that are seen in other terrains. So in this instance, the playbook doesn't really change, right? It's more like the cultural terrain that here is changing. If we can go to the next slide, please. The second case study that we have is Super Bowl, and specifically looking at the 2026 Super Bowl. So this is a really interesting case. We're primarily looking at this through a domestic lens, not really a foreign one. But that speaks to one of the arguments that we want to make today, which is that in this context, foreign versus domestic, the distinction doesn't really matter as much when it comes to impacts. And there are similar mechanics and TTPs that are being deployed in both instances. It's the origin that changes here. So, for those again who aren't aware and didn't follow the Super Bowl, this year Bad Bunny was announced as the halftime performance, which is a massive cultural event in the US. And so, in the direct aftermath of when Bad Bunny was announced as the halftime performer, the playbook that was deployed was a very familiar one. So immediately, the fact that he is Puerto Rican and that he speaks in Spanish and that he sings in Spanish was framed as something that was politically suspect. And we saw a lot of identity-based disinformation here. And he was very much framed, and the Super Bowl halftime was framed as anti-American. And that was then used, for instance, by Turning Point USA to create an alternative platform. And so we saw another halftime show that was set up and that was positioned as in English and truly American. Another interesting point here is the presidential amplification that is really important in this context because there was a certain authority that comes with the Oval Office commenting on this choice. And so that immediately took this cultural moment into a national flashpoint. Another interesting component here is some false quotes that were attributed to Jason Kelce, who, again, for those who aren't aware, he's an NHL player. He has a podcast called New Heights that he co-hosts with his brother, Travis Kelce, who some of the Swifties might have heard about because he is engaged to Taylor Swift. And so when those false claims were debunked later, even though they'd been attributed to Jason Kelce, that didn't really put an end to this controversy. It just redirected it and it shifted and it continued to be fueled. And the fact here that those quotes were attributed to someone who has such a politically diverse platforms, his podcast with his brother is consumed by millions and has a very politically diverse range, is something that's important to understand here in terms of context. And so what these cases show is that DME and FIMI, they often use the same playbook. And those actors learn off of each other in terms of tactics. And so that really matters when we're thinking about intervention. Next slide, please.
So before we get into the specifics of other individual celebrity cases, I want to explain a little bit more about celebrity culture being an effective terrain. Um, it's not a place just for like individual controversies to be exploited, right? It's not just big events like the Super Bowl or like Eurovision. Um, the whole ecosystem is sort of built uh, for the kind of manipulation that we're talking about. For some of the things that we mentioned earlier, like these spaces go unmonitored. They reach fandom spaces, so it's not it's not as difficult to reach these people as overtly political content might be. Women and children are really active in these spaces. And they are often communities that are deeply engaged and emotionally invested in whatever their fandom is. Um, so that means that their responses might be different, and how deep into a rabbit hole they might be willing to take something is often different. Um, so there's like an identity versus information point that is really critical, because once a controversy enters a fandom ecosystem, it stops behaving like information because of that emotional response, and it starts to behave like identity. So people stop sharing things because it's information or because it's accurate, and they start sharing it because it resonates with how they see the world. It resonates with how they feel about a particular actor in this space. Um, and it resonates with their beliefs around right and wrong. And so that makes what happens in these spaces really resilient to correction. Um, Misogyny as an infrastructure is the frame that we use for gendered dimension, gendered punishment, racial tropes, anti-LGBTQ plus framing. All of these are functional tools that are really active in these type of spaces. And all of them are used to normalize hostility while making this seem non-political and like a cultural opinion or a cultural commentary, rather than any sort of manipulation, often coordinated. Um, and these are really easy to scale. And because of that, they are extremely effective. So, to Zoe's point earlier, Travis Kelce has, I think, 2.1 million listeners a week to his podcast, or something in that range. It's really high. When you multiply that with the amount of Swifties in the world, and you attribute something rightly or wrongly to, I said Travis, but it was Jason, to Jason Kelce, then you have multiple fan bases that jump on this, right? We have all of the NFL. That's American football, in case anyone was unaware. And then we have all of the Swifties. So it's two very, very different groups that have now converged into one controversy, millions and millions of people worldwide. And how will we ever pick apart what has been seeded as a falsehood and is not, and is now being corrected? So Zoe's going to walk us through some very specific cases on this, and I think then we'll have some room for questions.
If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll run through some case studies that we've been doing that is looking specifically at Blake Lively, Taylor Swift, Amber Heard, and Meghan Markle. So I'll just highlight a couple of interesting trends that we have seen. So one of them is that foreign actors are definitely invested in some of these celebrity cases. And a really good example of that is with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. So, just to give you a bit of an idea, Sputnik Global published 77 articles mentioning Amber Heard during the Fairfax County trial. So, that was over about a 2 month period. The coverage was not incidental, it was always framed portraying Johnny Depp as a victim. And the sourcing here kind of matters. I want to give a little bit more context on Adam Waldman, so Johnny Depp's lawyer, who was used multiple times as main source without necessarily there being context on who he was. And he has documented ties to a sanctioned Russian oligarch. I will maybe butcher the name, I'm sorry in advance, Oleg Deripaska. And he has known lobbying ties with the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so that connection matters. It doesn't show per se a level of direct coordination, but it does illustrate an important point here, which is that these celebrity cases, the networks and the actors that are involved can intersect with more traditional terrains that we look at in terms of influence operation. Another interesting trend here is the use of these celebrity cases, and in this instance of Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, to continue spreading that narrative of Western cultural decline. And so in this instance, this case was very much used to say that like Western men are being persecuted, sorry, by these false, supposedly allegations, and that echoes domestic narratives, right, that are being disseminated, for instance, by the manosphere and right-wing ecosystems. That's something that was very much omnipresent throughout that trial and also in the aftermath of the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. Another interesting case here is with Meghan Markle. And so what we saw, and you can see a screenshot on the slides right now, is that the Kremlin's using these celebrity cases to attract a like broader audience that would read about Amber Heard, Meghan Markle, etc. And then like kind of like bring that audience back to a more overt pro-Kremlin messaging. And so an example here is with Meghan Markle, and then using that to attract an audience to then redirect it to pro-Kremlin propaganda, specifically on Ukraine. If we can switch to the next slide, please. So one of the points here that we want to discuss, and we mentioned this a little bit before, I think Rachel did, is the use of the same types of TTPs, so tactics, techniques, and procedures that are used across these celebrity cases and then more conventional influence operations. And so even though the terrain is different, the tactics that are used and the type of behaviors that we've observed are the same. And so in this instance, we can see, for instance, that RT and Sputnik have amplified controversial voices. We've also seen that the Pravda network linked the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial to the adrenochrome conspiracy theory. So kind of like bridging that gap between these high visibility cultural moments and redirecting the audience towards more extreme content. Another interesting example is the transvestigation of Taylor Swift. And so kind of using that discourse and tactic that does attract growing audiences in domestic spheres, as we've seen that being deployed against a myriad of cisgender women, going from First Lady of France, Brigitte Macron, to Michelle Obama also back in the day. Lately, this has been deployed also in the last Olympics, for instance, against the Algerian boxer Iman Khalif, but also Erica Kirk. And so again, kind of like taking this tactic that's rooted in identity-based information manipulation, but applying it to Taylor Swift, which, as we've mentioned before, has one of the largest online communities. So any content touching and involving Taylor Swift is most likely to attract a very broad audience. Um, I'll let us go to the next slide to discuss some of the consequences of all of this.
Yeah, I just want to add a little addendum to what Zoe talked about, and that is that in most, not most, many people recognize that going to a place like Sputnik or RT for your political content is probably not ideal. And so by delivering political content masked as celebrity content, they have a broader audience than they might have if they just published the same content as a political story. So that is just something for us all to be thinking about. And so where does this all lead us? So one of the things that I think we really need to think about is that this is a space where radicalization can actually begin. So we all have probably studied the standard radicalization model, and especially when we're talking about red pill or the manosphere, we understand that they might get fed Andrew Tate and then they end up in the red pill pipeline, and the intervention conversation starts there. Like they've already been exposed to Andrew Tate. But we're describing a different entry point. We're saying that something like hashtag Team Depp is not obviously ideological. It feels like a celebrity controversy. It feels like, oh, I'm taking a side in a messy public breakup that happens to also be a court case. But the content that circulates around Johnny Depp is doing a lot of work, right? It's normalizing the idea that women who make abuse allegations are liars. It's framing institutional processes as being systematically biased against white men. It builds an emotional investment in a particular version of gendered politics. And it does all of this before we've even considered that the bridge between a cultural space and a political space has already been crossed. And so by the time anyone in this environment is now introduced to Andrew Tate, the groundwork for this type of gendered politics has already been laid. Um, the Taylor Swift transvestigation is really similar, right? On the surface, it looks absurd. Like for most people, you go, this is just crazy. I don't, it's a conspiracy theory. I don't need to think about it. But maybe we need to be thinking about how it trains people in cultural spaces to apply a conspiratorial lens to female public figures or to distrust the presented identity, or to see manipulation or deception, especially from certain figures, whether it's women or other marginalized people or communities, as a default. So it's it's the stepping stones to more serious conspiratorial thinking, to the seeds of narratives that are already like vastly employed in political and other types of information integrity spaces. And so what makes this really, really important, makes it so significant to the work we do as a community, is that there's zero friction to enter this space. None. Like literally anyone can make a TikTok video, a YouTube video, a post, anything that engages a fandom. And you don't have to already be radicalized to join a fandom. So just by being actively engaged in something that makes you happy or that you like spending your time in, could put you in contact with narratives and other types of TTPs that are purpose built to start a radicalization pathway. You don't have to hold any prior political views. You don't have to do anything except potentially have an opinion on a celebrity court case. Um, and think of the millions and millions of emotionally engaged, largely unaware of the content that they are consuming, public that views this as entertainment when in fact it has already put them on a path. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is how this is a real entry point, um, for radicalization, and how if we don't treat this terrain as a threat, that we just have this slow saturation of manipulated content, seeded narratives, DEMI and FIMI actors, and no real way to intervene. Next slide.
So I know we're almost at time, but I'll bring us through really briefly on what's next to come and what we feel needs to happen to fill that gap. And the very first next step is filling the evidence-based gap by doing more research and very much looking at this at a larger scale. Like we've presented a couple of case studies, but there's so much that has not been covered yet. And so we need to be paying closer attention to this on different platforms. So looking at X, TikTok, Instagram, comparing behavioral patterns, and also getting a broader understanding across various languages. Like today, we've only looked at English language, but it would be fascinating to do that across more languages and ecosystems, and very much building that evidence based. That second element here is making sure that the frameworks that we're currently developing to understand and monitor online harms and online threats are adapted and taking into account what we're seeing in these cultural terrains, and that they're included. For instance, when we're doing TTP mapping and disarm, making sure that we're not just looking at what's going on during elections or during geopolitical crisis, but also what's going on in these celebrity and cultural spaces. A third point here is on cross-sector collaboration. I won't go too much into this because I really want to speak to something else also, which is the potential that is completely untapped here in terms of strategic communications to bring more awareness on how information manipulation works, it's carried out, and to build critical thinking to that with audiences that might not consume campaigns that are being designed on these traditional terrains, but that you might have the potential to engage because they have an interest in celebrity cases or the Super Bowl, etc. And so an example here is last year when the Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively court case started to unfold, you have an outlet such as People magazine that published an article on what's astroturfing and how does that work. And so that's just something to keep in the back of our minds in terms of like how we could use this also to bring more resilience. Um, and just as a closing, if we can go to the next slide, I think one of the points that we've made throughout today's session is that isn't really a boundary between cultural spaces and political spaces, and that these narratives that start in fandom spaces and celebrity controversies, they migrate. And so it's really important to understand that and to understand how that shapes who people trust, if people have trust in institutions, and what they're willing to accept.
And just the last bit on that is that we really advocate that this is not a niche research problem. It is something that we could use as an early warning signal. And we just need more people to start watching the space. And we would love to have more people in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And I have to say that I really appreciate how you really highlighted a lot of aspects that we're often missing out. And for instance, the fact that a lot of what we call culture wars today are often pop culture wars. And I think something that is particularly crucial, if I may say, is the capacity of these spaces to produce factions, because we have the oversimplification of like, what side are you on? In this or that controversy, and also strong fandoms which work as a sort of built-in in-group identity, and this element, of course, is central. I'm glad to open the Q&A. We already received a bunch of questions from the audience. Please keep them coming if you would like. I highlighted one out of the few, and maybe we can start addressing this. So somebody asks, are there specific indicators that practitioners should look for early on to understand when a cultural moment becomes terrain for FIMI actors?
I I think that you just hit on something, right? It's that creating of like opposing spaces. So as soon as that starts to happen, as soon as you see this divide of like an us versus them, especially when that us versus them starts to fall into something that we would consider a wedge issue, it is highly likely at that point that it is being weaponized. And so the the indicators are often, actually I can't think of any time that they're different. The indicators are exactly the same as they are in other types of information integrity or operations operations campaigns. So it's just that we're not applying those same indicators into this space. Um, and Zoe might want to add something on to that, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that as soon as we've seen this, and I think that you and I, Rachel, often have this discussion. As soon as there's this like viral moment that's popping into your feed and you don't really understand where that's coming from, that usually is a sign. And it usually means that there's something more going on there. And it's then kind of looking into it and exactly like just seeing the same pattern follow out again and again. So I think just being aware of that and then looking into it, thinking about like having that FIMI kind of like perspective already is just something that we need to like do more and more of.
Right, and to kind of follow up on the previous question, is the increasing convergence between FIMI and DB actors intentional, or is it just casual yet mutually beneficial from your observation?
I could maybe start with this one. There is each actor is coming at this to kind of like promote their own aim and get what they can get out of it, right? So as soon as a celebrity viral moment kind of like starts blowing up, we're not saying that there necessarily is a coordination, though there might be in certain instances, but each actor is coming at it from how can I use this moment and how can that be beneficial to the overall aim that I'm trying to achieve. And so when you look at Eurovision, for instance, because there's such a international and broad audience, you'll have different female actors that are going to weaponize Eurovision to carry out the aims of the campaigns that they're also carrying out in different terrains. And that also, you'll have also demi actors that then also have their own interest and see the potential of Eurovision and so come at it and promote their own campaign aims. So it it's everyone's trying to come at it to kind of like carry out their own benefits, right? Rachel, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
I agree with everything that Zoe said, but yes, sometimes I think it is intentional.
Mhm.
Sometimes I think that Demi actors in particular recognize that we don't think about or react to Demi in the same way. And so it makes it easy for them to spread FIMI narratives, because we're not going to hold domestic actors accountable in the same way because we just don't have the political will, or funding, to do that. So yes, I would say it is often intentional in both directions, but especially in that direction.
Mhm. Thank you. For the next questions, I would actually put the two that you see on top of the screen together because I think they resonate well with each other. So somebody asks, how should platforms rethink moderation in spaces that don't look political? And at the same time, I think we could also maybe address the role of platform algorithms in accelerating these narratives. So say the whole design.
We touched on this a little bit, that this is a radicalization space, right? So if people are running around saying that all women who make sexual assault allegations are liars who are just trying to target white men, and that all Western political systems are systematically discriminating against white men, um, you're in a radicalization space, right? Like it doesn't matter if it's about Andrew Tate or if it's about Johnny Depp. Um, and so it's really hard to talk about how platforms should rethink moderation because platforms don't do moderation. Um, and in fact, that's part of the reason that we all have jobs, right? Is that we do this kind of research and then say after the fact, hey, you probably should take this down. Um, and the algorithms play directly to that, right? So algorithms love engagement and emotion and certainty. And all of these celebrity spaces have that, right? They have outrage, they have drama, they have name calling, they have everything that you can think of. It's like a full-fledged soap opera playing out every single minute of every single day on the internet. And when they start to get into this sort of us versus them narrative, and somebody starts saying hashtag team Depp, hashtag team Justin, or they start talking about the weaponization of Me Too or how women are all liars, they are already ripe for that next level of radicalization, right? That's the entry point. So they're already well on their way to receiving the Andrew Tates of the world. And there's not much that we can do about it, because we, again, don't have platforms that are moderating. But we really need to think hard about this, because while you might have difficulty as a 14-year-old child actually entering the manosphere or an Andrew Tate style website, you have absolutely no issues entering into an online discussion about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, or about the kind of person that Meghan Markle is, or about Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. And so as researchers, how do we draw more attention to this space that can be so easily radicalized and so easily accessed by young people? And then we have to work towards what does that mean for moderation, and if we ever have it, clarity on algorithms.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I want to add a little bit by saying, as Rachel just mentioned, these spaces drive massive engagement. And that's why certain actors get into this, right? Some people, some actors who are not historically been engaged on cultural commentary have actually come to realize that by commenting on Johnny Depp, on Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively, that you will grow your audiences massively and get engagement. And that goes back to platforms' business models, right? So if you financially benefit from driving anger and extreme content, then that is there that comes into play when you want to apply any kind of moderation. And that's something that we need to be thinking about when then thinking of how platforms are going to moderate this type of content.
Thank you. And I think that with your answer, you also touched upon another question, which was how can we use the knowledge of this and inoculate our population to make them less susceptible to such influence with some form of awareness. Um, Maybe just the next that I see. Do you think tools like Disarm need to be adapted to better capture this phenomenon?
Yeah, I think of Disarm as like a living framework, right? Like we're constantly working to update Disarm to make it better, to make it apply to more use cases, and to make sure that it covers broadly how campaigns play out in the information ecosystem. And I hope that as that sort of living document grows, that it will grow to capture these kinds of things. Zoe and I definitely use it to tag articles that we use in our own research, and we actually hope to put some research out soon that is around the kinds of TTPs we see actively in this space and what that looks like using the disarm framework.
Fantastic. Um, for one last big question that would maybe allow you to give a broader comment, I would like to uh, put a bunch of things that were asked together. So, as you can read with me, is there a current focus on foreign non-West pop culture spaces? But also something that I also found interesting is a question about what radicalization pathways, besides the red pill, the manosphere, and anti-West sentiments, do you see in the pop space? And not to bring more stuff to the table, but I really appreciated this one is, are we also underestimating the role that lifestyle trends like Treadwives or the I'm Just a Girl trend or some reality shows play in normalizing ideological shifts toward conservatism? So your reaction to all of this?
I'm going with that one first. Yes, we are underestimating it. So this is a book that just recently came out that no one can see, but it's called Yesteryear, and it is about a trad wife experience, and it will soon be a movie with Anne Hathaway. And I'm very interested to see how this plays out. But this is very much a political space that we are. This one we aren't even ignoring as much, are we? Because many journalists have taken a stance on this and made commentary, especially around um, trad wife celebrities like Erica Kirk, who maybe talk about how other women should live, um, especially women in communities that would be deeply impacted. So working class women, single women, um, that kind of stuff. They would be deeply impacted by actually trying to live a trad life existence. But then they're being told by women who are primary breadwinners, who have jobs, who are active on the internet, who are creating the false illusion of living a trad wife existence, and then they're not really. And it definitely is about creating an ideological shift. And I'm not even sure it necessarily is towards conservatism as much as it is going back to that same idea of around misogyny, right? Like that women are lesser than, that women are stealing spaces from men, that women are hogging jobs, and that women owe men sex, that all of those kinds of different narratives that don't just live in conservatism.
Yeah, to add on to that, I think both of us would love to see more work on that specifically, and we've had multiple conversations. One of the angles that I'm particularly interested in for this is kind of like the different type of dog whistles that we're seeing emerging around this specifically. So you're seeing a lot of content on different social media platforms, for instance, about clean beauty or homeschooling, etc. And really quickly you see that that is very often redirected to more extreme content that is promoting very much anti-feminist and in some instances misogynistic content. And so seeing more work on that and how that pathway kind of like works would be really, really interesting. And I would love to see more of that. To comment on another question on non-Western perspective on this, we unfortunately haven't done that work, but I think it's really, really important to look at this outside of just here, like the Anglo-Saxon sphere. So that's also something that, yeah, would be absolutely fascinating to see more of.
K-pop.
Yeah.
It's really active in K-pop. Um, yeah, so maybe that's what's up next for us.
Thank you so much. That's great. We are unfortunately running out of time, but I really enjoyed this, and I would really like to thank you, Raquel and Zoe, for your fantastic presentation. I would like to also thank our attendees for asking so many questions, and my colleagues, Anna, Lucas, and Haney behind the scenes for making this webinar possible. We have upcoming webinars, as you can see on the screen. We have a couple for May and another for June already planned, but even more may pop up. And as mentioned earlier, the recording for today's webinar will be available soon on our YouTube channel and website, where you can also find all of our previous webinars. Don't forget to sign up for our bi-weekly newsletter. And also, if I may say, to check out the Cardigan Collective's website because they really have some very good pieces there. And finally, at the end of this webinar, we'll be presented with a feedback questionnaire. Please rate the webinar. Let us know what you would like to see next covered in our webinars. And that is really it for today. Thank you so much to everyone and have a lovely rest of the day slash long weekend. Bye bye.